He found her dying in a snowstorm, miles from anywhere, and every single person who heard the story later told him the same thing. You should have left her there and saved yourself. But the mountain man made a different choice, one that would cost him everything he'd built in 12 years of isolation and give him back something he thought he'd lost forever. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind screamed through the pines like something alive, something angry. Jack Sullivan pulled his collar tighter against his neck and squinted through the wall of white that had swallowed the Rocky Mountains whole. November storms up here didn't mess around. They came fast, hit hard, and didn't apologize. He'd seen it before, lived through worse. But something about this one felt different, felt mean. He was 53 years old, though the mirror in his cabin would have argued 58, maybe 60. Weather does that to a man. So does grief. His beard had gone silver years ago, his hands were scarred from decades of work, and his eyes carried the kind of distance that made people in town look away when he came down for supplies once a month. Not because he was cruel, because he reminded them that some pain doesn't heal, it just gets quieter. Jack had been living alone on this mountain for 12 years. 12 long, silent years since the day his world ended on a stretch of interstate outside Denver. His wife, Caroline, and their daughter, Lily, were heading to her piano recital. He was supposed to meet them there. Work ran late. He never made it. A semi-truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. By the time Jack got to the hospital, there was nothing left to say goodbye to except 2 names on a sheet and a wedding ring they handed him in a plastic bag. He couldn't go back to the house after that. Couldn't walk past Lily's room with her stuffed animals still arranged on the bed the way she liked them. Couldn't sit at the kitchen table where Caroline used to read the paper and hum while she drank her coffee. So he didn't. He sold everything, bought 40 acres in the mountains 2 hours from the nearest town, and built a cabin with his own 2 hands. No phone, no internet, no neighbors. Just him, the trees, and the kind of silence that either kills you or teaches you to live with yourself. Most days, he wasn't sure which one it was doing. The town below, Timber Ridge, population 372, knew him only as the ghost on the mountain. The man who showed up once a month to buy canned goods, batteries and kerosene, paid in cash, and left without making eye contact. Some folks pitied him, others were scared of him. A few thought he was crazy. Jack didn't correct any of them. It was easier that way. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he was checking his trap lines before the storm buried them for a week, and he'd already lost feeling in his left hand even through the glove. He should have turned back an hour ago, should have trusted his gut when the sky went that particular shade of grey that meant trouble. But he'd been running low on meat, and winter was coming whether he was ready or not. He trudged through knee-deep snow, his breath clouding in front of him, boots crunching with each step. The trees around him groaned under the weight of ice. Branches snapped in the distance like rifle shots. He reached the 4th trap, empty, and cursed under his breath. 5th trap, same story. He was about to give up and head back when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Crying, faint, muffled, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable. Jack froze. His first thought was an animal, maybe a wounded fox or a coyote caught in something. But no, this was different. This was human. This was a child. He turned slowly, scanning the white chaos around him. The crying came again, weaker this time, from somewhere to his left. He moved toward it, heart pounding, his mind racing through possibilities. Hikers? Lost campers? Who the hell would bring a kid up here in November? Then he saw her. A small shape huddled beneath a massive fallen pine, barely visible against the snow. She was curled into a ball, arms wrapped around her knees, her face buried against her chest. She wore a thin purple jacket, jeans and sneakers. Sneakers. In a mountain snowstorm. Her hair was dark, matted with ice, and her skin had gone that terrible pale color that meant hypothermia wasn't a risk anymore. It was already happening. Jack dropped to his knees beside her, his hands shaking, and not from the cold. "Hey," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Hey, sweetheart, can you hear me?" The girl didn't respond. Her eyes were half closed, her lips blue. She was shivering, but barely. That was bad. When the shivering stops, it means the body's giving up. Jack's mind went into overdrive. Every instinct he'd honed over 12 years of survival screamed at him. Get her warm. Get her dry. Get her out of this storm. But another voice, quieter, darker, whispered something else. You can't do this. You don't know how to take care of a kid anymore. You couldn't even protect your own daughter. What makes you think you can save this one? He shoved the voice down and scooped the girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel how cold she was, even through his coat. He wrapped her in his heavy canvas jacket, tucking it around her like a blanket, and started moving. The trek back to the cabin was hell. The storm had picked up, visibility down to maybe 10 feet. Snow came sideways now, stinging his face, filling his eyes. He couldn't feel his hands anymore, couldn't feel his feet, but he kept moving, one boot in front of the other. The girl clutched tight against his chest. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't making any sound at all. Stay with me, he muttered, though he didn't know if she could hear him. Come on, kid, stay with me. Twice he stumbled and nearly went down. Twice he caught himself. The third time he did fall, landing hard on his side in the snow, the girl still wrapped tight in his arms. For a moment, he just lay there, gasping, every muscle screaming. He was 53 years old. He'd lived alone for over a decade. He'd spent the last 12 years actively avoiding responsibility for anyone but himself. And now, here he was, hauling an unconscious child through a blizzard, because what? Because he couldn't leave her to die? Yeah, that was exactly why. He pushed himself up, adjusted his grip on the girl, and kept going. By the time he saw the cabin through the trees, his vision was blurring. He kicked the door open, stumbled inside, and laid the girl down on the bed in the corner. She didn't move, didn't open her eyes. Jack's hands shook as he started a fire in the wood stove, shoving in kindling, logs, anything that would burn. The flames caught, and he cranked the vent open wide. Then he turned back to the girl and started working. He peeled off her wet clothes as carefully as he could, his big, clumsy hands struggling with tiny zippers and buttons. Her skin was ice to the touch. He grabbed every blanket he had, wool, fleece, quilts his wife had made a lifetime ago, and piled them on top of her. He filled a pot with snow, set it on the stove to melt, and heated it until it was warm but not hot. Then he soaked a cloth and pressed it gently against her hands, her feet, her face, trying to bring warmth back into her extremities without shocking her system. Come on, he whispered. Come on, kid. Don't do this. For 20 minutes, nothing changed. She just lay there, pale and still, and Jack felt the old familiar panic rising in his chest. The same panic he'd felt in that hospital 12 years ago when they told him there was nothing they could do. The same helplessness. The same rage at a universe that took and took and took without ever giving anything back. Then, finally, she coughed. It was a small, wet sound, but it was something. Her eyelids fluttered. Her fingers twitched beneath the blankets. Jack let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That's it, he said quietly. That's it. You're okay. You're safe now. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused, confused. They were brown, big and round and terrified. She stared at him like she didn't know where she was or who he was or what was happening. Then she started to cry. Not the weak, fading cry from before, but a real, full-bodied sob that shook her whole frame. Jack didn't know what to do. He hadn't comforted a child in 12 years, hadn't held anyone in 12 years. But some instincts, he realized, don't die. He reached out slowly, carefully, and placed a hand on her shoulder. Hey, he said softly. Hey, it's okay, you're safe, I'm not going to hurt you. She flinched away from his touch, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the single window, the stove crackling in the corner, the shelves lined with canned goods and hunting gear. It was the home of a man who'd given up on the world. It probably looked like a prison to a scared little girl. "Where am I?" she whispered. Her voice was so small, so fragile. "My cabin," Jack said. Up on the mountain. I found you out in the storm. You were freezing. I brought you here to get you warm." She stared at him, processing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Am I in trouble?" Jack's heart broke a little. "No, sweetheart, you're not in trouble. You're safe." She didn't look convinced. She pulled the blankets tighter and turned her face toward the wall. Jack stood up slowly, giving her space. He moved to the stove and started pulling together something for her to eat. Soup, he decided. He had canned chicken soup, the kind with noodles. Kids liked noodles, right? He couldn't remember. Lily had been 9 when she died. This girl looked maybe 6, maybe 7, younger than Lily, so much younger. He heated the soup in a dented pot, poured it into a ceramic mug since he didn't have any bowls that weren't chipped or stained, and brought it over to the bed. "You need to eat," he said gently. "Get something warm in you." The girl didn't move, didn't look at him. Jack set the mug on the small table beside the bed and backed away. "It's there when you're ready." He busied himself with other things, checking the fire, securing the door against the wind that was now howling like a living thing outside. He tried not to stare at her, tried to give her space, but his eyes kept drifting back. She was so small, so fragile. What the hell was she doing out here? Where were her parents? How long had she been lost? After a few minutes, she reached for the mug. Her hands shook and she almost dropped it, but she managed to get it to her lips. She took a sip, then another, then drank it down like she hadn't eaten in days. Maybe she hadn't. When she was done, she set the mug down and looked at him for the first time with clear, focused eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack nodded. "You're welcome." Silence stretched between them. The wind rattled the windows. The fire crackled. Neither of them knew what to say. Finally, Jack pulled up a chair and sat down a few feet from the bed. He kept his voice low, non-threatening. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl hesitated. Then, so quietly he almost didn't hear it, she said, "Emma." "Emma," Jack repeated. "That's a good name. I'm Jack." She didn't respond, just watched him with those big, scared eyes. "Emma," he said carefully, "can you tell me what happened? How you ended up out there in the storm?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment, Jack thought she was going to start crying again. But she didn't. She took a shaky breath and said, "We crashed." Jack's stomach dropped. "Who crashed?" "The car," she whispered. "We were driving, and then we were spinning, and then we hit something, and then—" Her voice trailed off. "Who was with you?" Jack asked gently. "Your mom? Your dad?" Emma shook her head. "My foster parents, Linda and Mark. They were taking me to a new home, somewhere safe. But the car went off the road and I woke up and they weren't moving, and I got out and I walked and I got lost and I was so cold and I thought I was going to die." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, and by the end she was crying again, big, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. Foster parents. Jesus. That explained the thin jacket, the lack of preparation. They probably weren't from around here. Didn't know how fast these mountain roads could turn deadly when the weather shifted. Jack's mind raced. If there was a crash, there would be a search party. Cops, rangers, search and rescue. But the storm... He glanced toward the window where snow was piling up against the glass. The storm had been building for hours. If the crash happened before the worst of it hit, the wreckage could already be buried under 3 feet of snow. And if Linda and Mark weren't moving when Emma left... He pushed the thought away, one problem at a time. "Okay," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Okay, Emma. Here's what we're going to do. I don't have a phone up here, no way to call for help right now. But as soon as this storm clears, we'll get you down the mountain to town, to the sheriff. They'll help you. They'll find out what happened and make sure you're taken care of. But for now, you need to rest. You need to get warm and strong again. Can you do that?" Emma nodded slowly, still crying, but quieter now. Jack stood up and moved to an old trunk in the corner of the cabin. He hadn't opened it in years. Didn't like to. Inside were things he'd kept from before, things he couldn't bring himself to throw away. He dug past Caroline's sweaters, past the photo albums he'd never look at again, and found what he was looking for: Lily's clothes. He pulled out a faded purple sweatshirt with a cartoon cat on it, and a pair of soft pajama pants covered in stars. They were too big for Emma, but they were dry and warm, and that's what mattered. He brought them over and set them on the bed. "These will be more comfortable than those blankets. You can change when you're ready. I'll turn around." He did, facing the wall, giving her privacy. He heard the rustling of fabric, the soft sounds of her moving. When she said, "Okay," he turned back. She looked impossibly small in Lily's old clothes, the sleeves hanging past her hands, the pants pooling around her feet, but she looked warmer, less like a ghost. "Better?" Jack asked. Emma nodded. "Good. Now you need to sleep, real sleep. I'll keep the fire going. You're safe here, Emma, I promise." She looked at him for a long moment, those big brown eyes searching his face for something. Trust, maybe, or just proof that he meant what he said. Finally, she lay down and pulled the blankets up to her chin. Jack grabbed a worn quilt from the foot of the bed and moved to the chair by the fire. He'd sleep there tonight. Keep watch. Make sure the fire didn't go out. Make sure Emma stayed warm. As he settled into the chair, he looked over at her. She was already asleep, her breathing slow and steady, her face peaceful for the first time since he'd found her. Jack stared into the flames, his mind spinning. What the hell had he just done? He'd taken in a lost child, a traumatized, scared little girl who'd just survived a crash that probably killed her foster parents. He had no idea how to take care of a kid, no idea what to say to her, how to help her, how to make any of this okay. And the storm. He glanced toward the window again. The wind was still screaming. Snow was still falling. He'd lived on this mountain long enough to read the signs. This wasn't a one-night storm. This was the kind that settled in for days, maybe a week. The roads down the mountain would be impassable. The town would be cut off. Search parties wouldn't be able to get up here even if they knew where to look. Which meant he was stuck. Stuck in a cabin with a traumatized child, no way to call for help, no way to get her to safety. Just the two of them, a wood stove, and whatever canned goods he had left in the pantry. Jack leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. For 12 years he'd lived alone because it was easier. Because he didn't have to worry about failing anyone else. Didn't have to watch someone he cared about slip away. Didn't have to feel that crushing, suffocating weight of responsibility. But now, with Emma asleep 10 feet away, wrapped in his dead daughter's clothes, he felt it all come rushing back. The fear, the doubt, the absolute terror of being responsible for another human life. He opened his eyes and looked at her again. She'd shifted in her sleep, one small hand clutching the edge of the blanket, her face still pale but no longer blue. She was alive. He'd saved her, at least for now. But what happened next? What happened when she woke up tomorrow and the storm was still raging? What happened when she asked about her foster parents? What happened when the food started running low? What happened when she realized she was trapped on a mountain with a stranger who barely remembered how to talk to people, let alone care for a child? Jack didn't have answers. All he had was the growing realization that his quiet, solitary life, the one he'd built so carefully over 12 years, was over. The moment he'd picked Emma up in that storm, the moment he'd carried her back to this cabin, everything had changed. He wasn't just a man on a mountain anymore. He was responsible for keeping a little girl alive, and outside the storm showed no signs of stopping. The first morning came grey and cold. Jack woke to the sound of wind still battering the cabin walls and Emma's soft breathing from the bed. He'd barely slept, just dozed in the chair by the fire, waking every hour to add another log, to make sure the flames didn't die. His back ached, his neck was stiff, but none of that mattered when he looked over and saw Emma still asleep, still safe, still alive. He moved quietly, trying not to wake her, and stepped outside to assess the damage. The world had disappeared. Everything was white, buried under at least 3 feet of fresh snow, maybe more. The trees were bowed under the weight. Some had snapped completely. The path he'd carved out yesterday was gone, filled in like it had never existed. And the sky, still grey, still heavy, promised more to come. They weren't going anywhere. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow either. Jack went back inside, stamped the snow from his boots, and started breakfast. Oatmeal. He had plenty of that. He cooked it on the wood stove, added some honey he'd traded for in town months ago, and set it on the table. When he turned around, Emma was awake, watching him from the bed with those big, careful eyes. "Morning," Jack said, keeping his voice gentle. "You hungry?" Emma nodded slowly and climbed out of bed. She was still wearing Lily's clothes, the sleeves rolled up now so her hands could peek through. She sat at the table without a word, and Jack placed the bowl in front of her. She ate slowly, methodically, like she was afraid the food might disappear if she went too fast. Jack sat across from her with his own bowl, but he barely touched it. He was too busy watching her, trying to figure out what to say, how to help. "Storm's still going," he said finally. "We're going to be stuck here a few more days at least." Emma looked up at him, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "It's okay," Jack added quickly. "We've got food, we've got heat. You're safe here, I promise." She nodded but didn't say anything, just went back to her oatmeal. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Jack wasn't used to this anymore, wasn't used to filling quiet spaces with words, with comfort. For 12 years, silence had been his companion, his refuge. Now it felt like a wall he didn't know how to climb. He cleared his throat. You like to draw?" Emma's eyes flicked up to him, surprised. Then she nodded just a little. Jack stood and rummaged through a drawer until he found an old notebook and a pencil. He brought them over and set them in front of her. "In case you get bored, it's not much, but—" Emma picked up the pencil, turning it over in her small hands. "Thank you," she whispered. After breakfast, Jack tried to keep himself busy. He checked the traps near the cabin, though he knew they'd be empty. He split firewood in the small covered area beside the door, the rhythm of the axe helping to quiet his mind. He could see Emma through the window, sitting at the table, drawing in the notebook. Her head was bent in concentration, her tongue poking out slightly from the corner of her mouth. It hit him like a punch to the gut. Lily used to do that. Used to stick her tongue out when she was focused on her homework, or coloring, or building something with her blocks. The memory was so sharp, so vivid, that Jack had to stop mid-swing and just stand there, breathing hard, fighting the wave of grief that threatened to pull him under. He hadn't thought about Lily this clearly in years. He'd trained himself not to. Taught himself to push the memories down, to lock them away in that trunk with her clothes and the photo albums and everything else he couldn't bear to look at. But now, with Emma here, it was like someone had pried the lock open and everything was spilling out. He finished splitting the wood and came back inside. Emma was still drawing, her small hand moving across the page in careful strokes. She didn't look up when he entered. Jack hung up his coat and moved to the shelves, pretending to organize canned goods he'd organized 100 times before. He needed something to do with his hands, something to keep him from thinking too hard about why this little girl's presence was tearing him apart and putting him back together at the same time. "What are you drawing?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Emma looked up, hesitated, then turned the notebook around so he could see. It was a picture of the cabin. Simple, childlike, but recognizable. She'd drawn the wood stove, the bed, the window with snow piled against it, and in the corner, a stick-figure man with a beard standing beside a smaller stick-figure girl. Jack's throat tightened. "That's really good, Emma." She almost smiled. Almost. "My teacher said I was good at art." "Your teacher was right." Emma pulled the notebook back and stared down at the drawing. "I miss school," she said quietly. "I miss my friends." Jack sat down across from her. "Where were you living before Linda and Mark?" "Denver," Emma said, "in a group home. There were 8 of us. Linda and Mark were supposed to take me to their house in the mountains. They said it would be better there, quieter." "What happened to your real parents?" Jack asked gently. "If you don't mind me asking." Emma's face went carefully blank. My mum's in jail. My dad, I don't know where he is. I haven't seen him since I was 4. 4 years old. Jesus. This kid had been through more in her short life than most people dealt with in 50 years. I'm sorry, Jack said, and he meant it. Emma shrugged, a gesture that tried to be casual but carried the weight of someone who'd learned not to expect much from the world. It's okay. The group home wasn't so bad. Miss Rachel was nice. She let us watch movies on Friday nights. They fell into silence again, but this time it felt a little less heavy. The days began to blur together. Storm, fire, food, sleep, repeat. Jack and Emma settled into a routine that neither of them had planned, but both seemed to need. Mornings, Jack would cook breakfast while Emma drew in her notebook. Afternoons, when the wind died down enough, he'd show her things through the window. How to identify different animal tracks in the snow, how to tell a pine from a spruce, which clouds meant more snow was coming. She was a quiet kid, cautious, watchful. But slowly, so slowly Jack almost didn't notice at first, she started opening up. Little things. She told him she was 7 years old, that her favorite color was purple, that she hated carrots but loved macaroni and cheese, that she'd been in 3 different foster homes before Linda and Mark. And Jack, almost against his will, started opening up too. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Emma pointed to the trunk in the corner. What's in there? Jack tensed. Just old stuff. Things from before. Before what? He hesitated, every instinct telling him to deflect, to change the subject, but something in Emma's honest, open gaze made him answer truthfully. Before I moved up here, I used to live in the city, had a family. Emma's eyes widened. You have kids? Had, Jack corrected quietly. A daughter. Her name was Lily. She was 9 when she died. Emma's face fell. How did she die? Car accident, Jack said, his voice rough. Her and my wife both, 12 years ago. That's why you live up here alone? Jack nodded. Couldn't stay in the world after that. Hurt too much. Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then she said, I think that's sad. Yeah, Jack agreed. It is. Are those her clothes I'm wearing? Jack's chest tightened. Yeah. Emma looked down at the purple sweatshirt, running her small fingers over the faded cartoon cat. She had good taste. Despite everything, Jack almost smiled. She did. On the 5th day, Emma woke up screaming. Jack jerked awake in his chair, heart pounding, and saw her thrashing in the bed, still asleep, caught in the grip of a nightmare. Emma! He rushed over, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Emma, wake up! You're safe. It's just a dream. Her eyes flew open, wild and terrified. For a moment she didn't seem to see him. Then recognition flooded in, and she burst into tears. Jack did something he hadn't done in 12 years. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her into his arms. She clung to him, her small body shaking with sobs, her face pressed against his shoulder. I saw them, she gasped between cries. Linda and Mark, in the car. They weren't moving. There was blood, and I tried to wake them up, but they wouldn't wake up. And I was so scared, and I ran, and I got lost, and I thought I was going to die too. Shh, Jack murmured, one hand awkwardly patting her back. You're okay now. You're safe. I've got you. What if they're still there? Emma sobbed. What if they're still in the car, waiting for someone to help them? Jack's heart broke. Sweetheart, if they were in that car when the storm hit, then there wasn't anything anyone could do. You understand? You did the right thing getting out. You survived. That's what matters. But I left them, Emma cried. I left them there alone. You were trying to survive, Jack said firmly. You were 7 years old, scared and freezing. You did what you had to do. That's not wrong. That's not your fault. She cried for a long time, and Jack just held her, letting her get it all out. Eventually her sobs quieted to hiccups, then to shaky breaths. She didn't let go of him, though, just stayed pressed against his chest like she was afraid he might disappear too. Jack? She whispered. Yeah? Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you think Lily would be mad that I'm wearing her clothes? The question hit him harder than he expected. He had to swallow twice before he could answer. No, sweetheart. I think she'd be glad someone was getting use out of them. She was a kind girl. She wouldn't want you to be cold. Emma nodded against his shoulder. I bet she was nice. She was, Jack said quietly. She really was. When Emma finally fell back asleep, Jack laid her gently back on the bed and pulled the blankets up around her. He stood there for a long time, just looking at her. This small, broken, brave little girl who'd stumbled into his life and turned everything upside down. He was terrified, absolutely terrified, because for the first time in 12 years he cared about something again, about someone, and the thought of losing her, of failing her the way he'd failed his own family, was almost enough to make him want to run back into the storm and disappear. But he didn't run. He just sat back down in his chair and kept watch until morning. By the 6th day, the storm finally broke. The wind died down, the snow stopped falling, and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds. Jack stepped outside and assessed the situation. The snow was deep, deeper than he'd seen in years, but it was passable. Barely. He knew what he had to do. He went back inside where Emma was eating breakfast and sat down across from her. Storm's over, he said gently. Roads are still bad, but I can get us down the mountain if we go slow. We need to get you to town, to the sheriff. They need to know what happened, need to make sure you're taken care of properly. Emma's face went pale. Do I have to go? Yeah, sweetheart, you do. I'm not equipped for this. You need people who know what they're doing, social workers, doctors, people who can help you. But you helped me, Emma said quietly. You saved me. I kept you alive, Jack corrected. That's different from taking care of you the right way. You need more than I can give you up here. Emma looked down at her bowl, her small hands gripping the spoon tight. Okay, she whispered. 2 hours later, they were ready. Jack had packed Emma in layers, everything warm he could find, and they started the long trek down the mountain. He carried her on his back when the snow got too deep, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and didn't complain once. It took them nearly 4 hours to reach the main road, and another hour of walking before a truck finally came by. The driver, an old rancher named Pete, who Jack had seen around town, pulled over with wide eyes. Jack Sullivan? That you? Yeah, Jack said. Need a ride into Timber Ridge. Got an emergency. Pete looked at Emma, bundled in Jack's arms, and his expression shifted from surprise to concern. That a kid? Found her in the storm. She was in a car accident. Foster parents might be dead. Need to get her to the sheriff. Pete didn't ask any more questions, just opened the back door. Get in, I'll have you there in 20 minutes. The ride into town was quiet. Emma sat pressed against Jack's side, one small hand gripping his coat. Jack stared out the window, watching the familiar buildings of Timber Ridge appear through the trees, and felt a knot forming in his stomach. He hadn't been around this many people in months, hadn't had to explain himself, hadn't had to deal with questions and judgment and all the things he'd left behind 12 years ago. But he'd do it for Emma. He'd do whatever it took to make sure she was safe. Pete pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, a small brick building on Main Street. Jack climbed out, Emma still in his arms, and thanked Pete quietly. You need anything else, you let me know, Pete said, his eyes kind. Jack nodded and carried Emma inside. Sheriff Davis was at his desk, a man in his early 60s with grey hair and a face weathered by decades of dealing with small-town problems. He looked up when the door opened, and his eyes went wide when he saw Jack. Sullivan? Haven't seen you in 3 months. Been busy, Jack said shortly. Got a situation. He set Emma down gently, and she immediately moved behind him, peering out from behind his leg. This is Emma, Jack said. She was in a car crash up on the mountain during the storm. Her foster parents were driving her. I found her half frozen 5 days ago, brought her to my cabin until the storm passed. Davis's expression shifted from surprise to suspicion so fast it made Jack's stomach turn. You had a child in your cabin for 5 days. She would have died if I left her out there, Jack said, keeping his voice level. "Storm was too bad to get her down sooner. I did what I had to do." Davis stood up slowly, his hand moving to rest on his belt near his radio. "And you're just now bringing her in?" "Did you see the roads?" Jack shot back. "I barely got us down today. You think I could have made it 5 days ago in the middle of a blizzard?" Before Davis could respond, the door opened behind them. A woman in a grey suit stepped in, her expression all business. Margaret Hayes, the county social worker. Jack had never met her, but he'd heard about her. Tough, thorough, didn't take any nonsense. "Sheriff," she said. Then her eyes landed on Emma. "Is this the girl from the crash report?" "Crash report?" Jack asked. Davis nodded. "Search and rescue found a vehicle 3 days ago, buried in a snowbank about 12 miles up Highway 47. 2 adults inside, both deceased. They've been trying to locate a child who was supposed to be in the car. Emma Foster." Emma made a small sound behind Jack, and he felt her grip on his coat tighten. Margaret knelt down, her expression softening slightly. "Emma?" "Sweetheart, I'm Margaret. I'm here to help you. Can you come talk to me?" Emma shook her head and pressed closer to Jack. Margaret's eyes flicked up to Jack, assessing, calculating. "And you are?" "Jack Sullivan. I found her in the storm, took her to my cabin to keep her from freezing to death." "For 5 days." "For 5 days," Jack confirmed, his jaw tight. Margaret stood up. "Sheriff, I need to speak with Emma alone, and I need a full statement from Mr. Sullivan." What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Emma's hand tightened on Jack's coat so hard her knuckles went white. "No," she said, her voice small but firm. "I want to stay with Jack." Margaret's expression hardened. "Emma, I understand you've been through something traumatic, but Mr. Sullivan is a stranger. You need to come with me so we can make sure you're safe and healthy." "He saved me," Emma said, louder now. "He kept me warm, he gave me food. He's not a stranger, he's Jack." "Sweetheart," Margaret started. "No!" Emma's voice rose to a shout, and she wrapped both arms around Jack's leg. "I don't want to go. I want to stay with Jack." Jack looked down at her, his chest tight, and placed a gentle hand on her head. "Emma, these people, they're just trying to help." "Then why do they look at you like you did something wrong?" Emma demanded, and the question hit the room like a bomb. She was right. Jack could see it in their faces. Davis's suspicion, Margaret's cold assessment. They weren't seeing a man who'd saved a child's life. They were seeing a recluse, a hermit, someone who'd kept a little girl isolated in the mountains for nearly a week. The implications were written all over their expressions. "Emma," Jack said quietly, kneeling down so he was at her level. "I need you to go with Miss Hayes, okay? She's going to make sure you're okay, get you checked out by a doctor. It's important." "But—" "I'll be right here," Jack promised, even though he wasn't sure it was true. "I'm not going anywhere until we get this sorted out." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Promise?" Jack's throat tightened. "I promise." Margaret stepped forward and held out her hand. "Come on, Emma. Let's go get you looked at." Emma hesitated, then slowly let go of Jack's coat. She took Margaret's hand, but looked back at Jack with an expression that made him feel like he was abandoning her all over again. When the door closed behind them, Davis turned to Jack with hard eyes. "Sit down, Sullivan. We need to talk." The interrogation lasted 2 hours. Davis asked the same questions a dozen different ways. How did you find her? Why didn't you come down sooner? What exactly happened in that cabin? Did you touch her? Did you hurt her in any way? Jack answered each question with the same flat, exhausted honesty. He told them about the trap lines, about hearing her crying, about the storm, about the 5 days of keeping her warm and fed and safe. He left nothing out, even though every question felt like an accusation. By the time Davis was done, Jack felt like he'd been scraped raw. He sat in the hard plastic chair, hands clasped between his knees, staring at the floor, waiting for whatever came next. Davis leaned back in his chair. Medical examiner confirms the crash happened approximately 6 days ago. Weather reports confirm the storm hit the same day. Your story checks out, at least the timeline. I'm not lying, Jack said quietly. Didn't say you were. But you understand how this looks, right? A man who's been living alone in the mountains for over a decade suddenly shows up with a 7-year-old girl after keeping her in his cabin for nearly a week. Jack looked up, his eyes hard. I understand exactly how it looks, but I also understand that if I hadn't found her, she'd be dead. So you can judge me all you want, Sheriff, but I did the right thing. Before Davis could respond, the door opened and Margaret stepped back in. Her expression was unreadable. Emma's been examined, she said. No signs of abuse or mistreatment. She's malnourished and dehydrated, but the doctor says that's consistent with being lost in the wilderness for an extended period. She also won't stop talking about how Mr. Sullivan saved her life. Some of the tension left Jack's shoulders. Margaret sat down across from him. But we still have a problem. Emma is now a ward of the state. Her foster parents are deceased, and there's no family to claim her. She'll need to be placed in a new foster home. Okay, Jack said, though the word felt wrong in his mouth. She's asking for you, Margaret added. Says she wants to go back to the cabin with you. Jack's heart clenched. That's not... I can't. I'm not set up for that. I know, Margaret said, but I want you to understand what's going to happen. We're going to place Emma in temporary foster care here in Timber Ridge while we work on finding her a permanent placement. It could take weeks, maybe months, and during that time she's going to be confused and scared and probably very angry. I get that, Jack said quietly. Do you? Margaret leaned forward. Because in the time I spent with her just now, she talked about you like you're some kind of hero, like you're the only safe thing in her world right now, and when we take that away from her, it's going to hurt her. A lot. Jack closed his eyes. What do you want me to say? That I'll take her? I live alone in a cabin with no running water, no electricity, no phone. I barely interact with people. I don't know the first thing about raising a kid, especially one who's been through what she's been through. I'm not asking you to take her, Margaret said. I'm just making sure you understand the situation. But Jack could see it in her eyes. She was asking. Or at least she was wondering if he'd consider it. The door opened again, and Emma walked in with a uniformed officer behind her. She'd been given clean clothes, a blue sweater and jeans that actually fit, and her hair had been washed and brushed. But her eyes were red from crying. When she saw Jack, she ran to him. He caught her automatically, and she buried her face in his shoulder. They said I have to go to a foster home, she said, her voice muffled against his coat. They said I can't go back with you. Jack held her, one hand on the back of her head, and felt something break inside him. I know, sweetheart, I know. But I want to stay with you, Emma whispered. Please, I'll be good. I won't cause any trouble. Please don't make me go. Every instinct Jack had developed over 12 years of isolation screamed at him to let her go, to walk away, to go back to his mountain and his silence and his safety. He couldn't do this, couldn't open himself up to this kind of pain again. But then he remembered her curled up under that fallen tree, half frozen and dying. He remembered her small hand gripping his coat as he carried her through the storm. He remembered the way she'd looked at him when she woke up in his cabin, terrified but trusting him anyway. He remembered 5 days of watching her come back to life, of seeing her smile, of hearing her laugh when he taught her how to identify rabbit tracks in the snow. He remembered what it felt like to care about someone again. Jack pulled back enough to look Emma in the eyes. Listen to me. You need to go with Miss Hayes right now, okay? She's going to take you somewhere safe, somewhere with other people who can help you better than I can. But, Jack continued, his voice rough, I'm not going anywhere. You hear me? I'll be around. And when you're settled, I'll come visit if they let me. Emma's eyes searched his face. You promise? Jack swallowed hard. I promise. Margaret stepped forward and gently took Emma's hand. Come on, sweetie, let's go. Emma held on to Jack for one more moment, then slowly let go. Margaret led her toward the door, and Jack watched them go, feeling like someone was pulling his heart out of his chest. At the doorway, Emma turned back one more time. Jack? Yeah? Thank you for not leaving me in the snow. Then she was gone. Jack sat in that chair for a long time after they left, staring at the floor, trying to remember how to breathe. Sheriff Davis said something about him being free to go, about calling if they had more questions, but Jack barely heard him. He walked out of the sheriff's office into the cold afternoon air and just stood there. The town moved around him, people going about their lives, completely unaware that his had just been turned inside out. He made it halfway to the edge of town before he stopped. Ahead of him was the road back to the mountain, back to his cabin, back to his quiet, solitary life. Behind him was Timber Ridge, and somewhere in that small cluster of buildings was Emma, probably crying herself to sleep in some stranger's house. Jack stood there at that crossroads, hands shoved deep in his pockets, breath clouding in the cold air. For 12 years he'd been running from the pain of loss. He'd built walls so high and thick that nothing could get in, nothing could hurt him. And it had worked. He'd been numb, safe, alone. But Emma had gotten in somehow. In 5 days, this small, scared, brave little girl had cracked something open inside him that he thought was dead forever. And now he had a choice. He could go back to the mountain, go back to his traps and his wood stove and his silence. Let the social services system do its job. Let Emma become someone else's responsibility, someone else's story. Or he could do something that terrified him more than any storm ever could. He could fight. Jack turned around and started walking back toward town. His hands were shaking, his heart was pounding, but his steps were steady. He found the sheriff's office again and walked through the door. Davis looked up, surprised. "I need to know something," Jack said. "What would I have to do to become Emma's legal guardian?" Davis blinked. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." The sheriff sat back in his chair, studying Jack's face. "You'd need stable income, proper housing, background checks, character references, parenting classes. The list is long, Sullivan, and it's not easy." "I didn't ask if it was easy," Jack said. "I asked what I have to do." Davis pulled out a form from his desk drawer and slid it across to Jack. "Start with this. Petition for guardianship. But I gotta warn you, the county's gonna fight you on this. You're a single man with no parenting experience living in isolation. The odds aren't in your favor." Jack picked up the form and looked at it. The words blurred together, but he didn't care. He'd figure it out. "Where do I start?" he asked. And for the first time in 12 years, Jack Sullivan started building something instead of running away. The petition for guardianship sat on the table in front of Jack like a test he'd never studied for. Margaret Hayes sat across from him in her cramped office on the second floor of the county services building, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a stack of papers beside her that looked thick enough to build a house with. "Let me be very clear about what you're walking into," Margaret said, her voice all business. "The state of Colorado has very specific requirements for foster care and guardianship. You'll need to demonstrate stable employment with verifiable income. You'll need housing that meets state safety standards. That means running water, electricity, heat, proper square footage, separate sleeping quarters. You'll need to pass extensive background checks, both criminal and financial. You'll need character references from at least 3 people who can vouch for your ability to provide a safe, nurturing environment. And you'll need to complete a minimum of 30 hours of parenting classes." Jack listened, his jaw tight, his hands clasped on the table. Each requirement felt like a mountain he'd have to climb, and he'd only just come down from the one he'd been living on for 12 years. "How long do I have?" he asked. Margaret shuffled through her papers. "The preliminary hearing is scheduled for 8 weeks from now. That's when the judge will review your petition and determine if you're even eligible to proceed. If you pass that, then we move to a full evaluation process, which could take another 3 to 6 months. 8 weeks. Jack had 8 weeks to transform his entire life. "What about Emma?" he asked. "Where is she now?" She's been placed with the Hendersons, a local family who fostered several children over the years. They're good people, experienced. Emma is safe and cared for. Does she know I'm doing this? Margaret hesitated. Not yet. I didn't want to give her false hope in case you changed your mind. Jack met her eyes. I'm not changing my mind. Something shifted in Margaret's expression, just slightly. Then we should get started. The first thing Jack needed was a job. He'd been living off savings, odd jobs, and the occasional sale of furs and handcrafted items for the past 12 years. None of that would qualify as stable income in the eyes of the court. He walked into Timber Ridge Hardware at 8 in the morning, still uncomfortable in the clean jeans and flannel shirt he'd dug out from the back of his closet. The store smelled like sawdust and paint thinner. A man in his 60s stood behind the counter, grey hair pulled back in a ponytail, reading glasses sliding down his nose as he reviewed an invoice. Ray Campbell. Jack had bought supplies from him a handful of times over the years, never more than a few words exchanged. Ray looked up when the bell above the door chimed. His eyebrows rose. Jack Sullivan, twice in 1 week. That's got to be a record. I need a job, Jack said without preamble. Ray set down his invoice. Come again. I need steady work. 40 hours a week if you've got it. I can do inventory, heavy lifting, repairs. I'm good with tools, good with my hands. I don't complain and I show up on time. Ray studied him for a long moment. This about that little girl you brought in? Word traveled fast in small towns. Jack shouldn't have been surprised. Yeah, he admitted. It's about Emma. Ray leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. Heard you're trying to keep her. That true? Trying to, yeah. You know anything about raising a kid? Not a damn thing, Jack said honestly. But I'm willing to learn. Ray was quiet for another beat. Then he pulled off his reading glasses and tucked them in his shirt pocket. My daughter, she's grown now. Lives in Boulder with her husband and 2 kids. But when she was 7, her mother left. Just packed a bag one day and didn't come back. I had to figure out how to be a single dad overnight. No manual, no training, just me and a scared little girl who didn't understand why her mama didn't want her anymore. Jack waited. It was the hardest thing I ever did, Ray continued. Harder than building this business from nothing, harder than anything. But it was also the best thing. Kids, they don't need perfect. They need someone who shows up, who tries, who gives a damn. He pulled a keyring from his pocket and tossed it to Jack. Store opens at 7, closes at 6. You start tomorrow. $15 an hour to start. We'll talk raises after 90 days. Don't make me regret this. Jack caught the keys, his throat tight. I won't. The hardware store was just the beginning. Jack threw himself into the rest of Margaret's list with the same intensity he'd once used to survive alone in the wilderness. Different skills, same determination. He enrolled in the parenting classes held every Tuesday and Thursday evening at the community center. He was the only single man in a room full of couples, most of them young, nervous, preparing to adopt or foster for the first time. The instructor, a woman named Patricia with kind eyes and infinite patience, taught them about developmental stages, trauma responses, attachment theory, discipline strategies. Jack took notes in a spiral notebook he'd bought at Ray's store. He highlighted passages in the textbook they'd been given. He stayed after class to ask questions, even when they made him feel stupid and unprepared. One evening, Patricia pulled him aside. You're working really hard at this. Have to, Jack said simply. Got a lot of ground to make up. Can I ask you something? Why are you doing this? I mean, I know the basics, but what made you decide to fight for this child? Jack thought about Emma's small hand gripping his coat, about her drawing pictures of the cabin in that notebook, about the way she'd looked at him and said, You saved me. Because she saved me first, he said quietly. The cabin was next on the list. Jack had lived there for 12 years in conditions that suited him fine, minimal, rustic, functional, but the state had different standards for housing a child. He started with electricity, called in a solar company from the next town over, spent nearly every penny he'd saved on panels and a battery system. Then plumbing, a well-drilled, pipes run, A small water heater installed in what used to be a storage shed. Insulation came next, proper stuff, not just the newspaper and cardboard he'd been using, then drywall to cover it. A real bedroom for Emma, separate from the main living space, with a window that locked from the inside and a door that closed for privacy. He worked on the cabin every moment he wasn't at the hardware store or in parenting class. His hands were raw and bleeding by the end of most days. His back ached, his shoulders screamed, but he kept going. And then something unexpected started happening. People began showing up to help. First it was Ray from the hardware store, driving up on a Saturday morning with his truck full of leftover lumber and paint. "Can't have my employee living in a shack," Ray said gruffly. "Bad for the store's reputation." Then came Pastor Ruth Bennett from the Timber Ridge Community Church. Jack had never set foot in her church, never spoken to her before, but she showed up anyway with a casserole and an offer. "I remember you," she said, standing on his half-finished porch. "From before. I remember your wife and your daughter. I saw you at the funeral, though I don't think you saw me." Jack stiffened. "I don't really want to talk about that." "I'm not here to make you talk about it," Ruth said gently. "I'm here because I heard what you're doing for Emma, and I think it's brave, and I think you could use some help. I don't need charity." "Good, because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering friendship. There's a difference." Over the next few weeks, Ruth became one of Jack's most unexpected allies. She helped him navigate the paperwork, made phone calls on his behalf to expedite background checks, and most importantly, she became one of his 3 character references. The second reference came from Ray. The third, surprisingly, came from Sheriff Davis. "Don't get me wrong," Davis said when Jack asked him. "I still think you're crazy for trying this, but I've been watching you these past few weeks. You show up to that hardware store before Ray even unlocks the door. You sit in those parenting classes and actually pay attention instead of just checking a box. You're working your ass off to turn that cabin into a real home. That counts for something." But the real test came when Margaret finally allowed supervised visits. The first visit was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the county offices. Jack showed up 30 minutes early, showered, wearing the one decent button-up shirt he owned, his beard trimmed for the first time in months. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Margaret met him in the lobby. "Emma's in the conference room. I'll be observing the entire visit. You'll have 1 hour. Don't make any promises you can't keep. Don't talk about the guardianship process unless she asks, and if at any point she seems uncomfortable or upset, the visit ends. Understood?" "Understood," Jack said. Margaret led him down a hallway to a room with a big window, a table, some chairs, and a box of toys in the corner. Emma sat in one of the chairs, her legs swinging because they didn't quite reach the floor, wearing a pink sweater Jack had never seen before. When she saw him, her face lit up like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Jack!" She ran to him, and he knelt down just in time to catch her. She threw her arms around his neck, and he held her carefully, aware of Margaret watching from the doorway, aware that this could all be taken away in an instant. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough. "I missed you." "I missed you too," Emma said, pulling back to look at his face. "They said you were busy. They said you were working on something important." Jack glanced at Margaret, who gave him a small nod. "I'm working on a lot of things," Jack said carefully. "Trying to make some changes, so maybe if it works out, you could come stay with me for real." Emma's eyes went wide. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean, I'm trying," Jack said. "It's complicated and there are a lot of people who have to agree, but I'm doing everything I can." "The Hendersons are nice," Emma said quietly. "They have a dog named Buddy and they let me help make cookies. But it's not the same. It's not home." Jack's chest ached. "Where's home, Emma?" She looked at him like the answer was obvious. "With you. In the cabin. That's home." The visits became weekly, then twice a week. Each time, Jack brought something small, a book he'd found at the thrift store, a wooden whistle he'd carved, a packet of hot chocolate mix. Each time, Emma told him about school, about the other kids in her class, about the nightmares she still had sometimes about the crash. And each time, Jack left feeling like someone was reaching into his chest and squeezing his heart. She's attached to you, Margaret said after the 5th visit. You understand what that means, right? If this doesn't work out, if the judge denies your petition, it's going to devastate her. Then I'll make sure it works out, Jack said. But making it work out was harder than he'd anticipated. The background checks came back clean, no criminal record, no red flags. The housing inspection, however, was a different story. The inspector, a severe-looking woman named Diane Crawford, walked through Jack's cabin with a clipboard and a measuring tape, her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. The bedroom is adequate, she said, making a note. Electrical and plumbing meet minimum standards, but there's no carbon monoxide detector, no smoke alarm in the child's room, and this wood stove presents a burn hazard. I can install the detectors today, Jack said. And I can put a safety gate around the stove. Diane looked at him over her glasses. Mr. Sullivan, this is a cabin in the middle of nowhere. The nearest hospital is 45 minutes away. The nearest school is 30 minutes. If something happens to this child, if she gets sick or hurt, response time is going to be significantly delayed. I understand the risks, Jack said. But I grew up in places like this. Emma's already survived worse. I can keep her safe. That's not for you to decide, Diane said. That's for the court. She finished her inspection, handed Jack a list of deficiencies that needed to be corrected, and left without another word. Jack sat on his porch after she drove away, looking at that list, feeling the weight of it. Every item was doable, fixable, but time was running out. The preliminary hearing was in 2 weeks. He worked around the clock, installed smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, a fire extinguisher in every room, built a safety gate for the stove, added a first aid kit, emergency supplies, backup heating sources. He drove into town and paid for a satellite phone installation so he'd have emergency communication if the power went out. Ruth stopped by one evening while he was testing the smoke detectors and found him standing in the middle of the cabin, covered in drywall dust, looking completely lost. Talk to me, she said gently. I don't know if it's enough, Jack admitted. I'm doing everything they ask. But what if it's not enough? What if I'm not enough? Ruth sat down at his kitchen table, the one he'd sanded and refinished just last week. Let me tell you something about faith, Jack. It's not believing that everything will work out the way you want. It's believing that you're doing the right thing even when the outcome is uncertain. I haven't had much faith in anything for a long time, Jack said. I know, Ruth said, but you have faith in Emma. I can see it every time you talk about her. That's enough to start with. The preliminary hearing arrived on a cold Monday morning in late January. Jack put on the only suit he owned, bought second-hand from a thrift store in the next town over. It didn't fit quite right, the sleeves a little too short, the shoulders a little too tight, but it was the best he could do. He met Margaret outside the courthouse. She was carrying a thick folder full of documentation, everything they'd compiled over the past 8 weeks. You ready? She asked. No, Jack said honestly, but let's do it anyway. The courtroom was smaller than he expected, wood-paneled and quiet. Judge Patricia Chen sat behind the bench, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an unreadable expression. The county attorney, a young man named Derek Price, sat on one side with his own stack of papers. Margaret and Jack sat on the other. The judge reviewed the petition, flipping through pages, her face giving nothing away. The silence stretched so long Jack thought he might break from the tension. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Sullivan, I've read your petition and reviewed the supporting documentation. I've also read the inspector's report, your employment verification, your completion of the required parenting courses, and the character references provided by Mr. Campbell, Sheriff Davis, and Pastor Bennett. Jack held his breath. I have some concerns, Judge Chen continued. You have no prior experience raising children. You've been living in extreme isolation for over a decade. Your housing, while it now meets minimum standards, is remote and potentially dangerous for a young child. And according to the psychological evaluation, you suffer from unresolved grief and trauma related to the loss of your own family. Every word felt like a nail going into a coffin. However, the judge said, And Jack's head snapped up. I'm also looking at a man who has transformed his entire life in 8 weeks, who has secured stable employment, renovated his home, completed required training, and demonstrated a level of commitment that frankly surprises me. And most importantly, I'm looking at the social worker's notes from supervised visits, which indicate that Emma Foster has formed a strong, healthy attachment to you and has explicitly stated her desire to remain in your care. Judge Chen set down her papers and folded her hands. Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to grant provisional approval for your petition to proceed to full evaluation. This means you'll continue supervised visits with Emma while we conduct a more thorough assessment of your capability to serve as her guardian. During this period, you'll be required to attend ongoing therapy to address your grief and trauma. You'll also be required to participate in family counseling sessions with Emma. If, at the end of 90 days, both you and Emma demonstrate readiness for placement, I'll approve the guardianship. Jack felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Not denial, not approval, but a chance. Do you understand the conditions I've outlined? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor, Jack managed. Then we'll reconvene in 90 days for the final hearing. Miss Hayes, please coordinate the necessary appointments and continue to monitor the situation closely. The gavel came down. Jack stood there, not quite processing what had just happened, until Margaret touched his arm. Come on, she said. Let's go tell Emma. They drove to the elementary school where Emma was in 2nd grade. Margaret had arranged for them to meet in the counselor's office during Emma's lunch period. Jack waited in the small room, his palms sweating, his heart racing, until the door opened and Emma walked in. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes going wide. Jack, what are you doing here? Jack knelt down so he was at her level. I wanted to tell you something important. The judge said yes. Not all the way yes yet, but yes enough that we can keep trying. Which means more visits. And if everything goes the way I hope, maybe in a few months you can come live with me for real. Emma's face went through about 6 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, hope, disbelief, joy, fear, and finally settling on something that looked like cautious happiness. Really? She whispered. Really, Jack said. But we've got some work to do first, both of us. We have to go to some meetings together, talk to some people, prove that we're ready. Think you can do that? Emma nodded so hard her whole body moved. Then she threw herself at Jack, wrapping her small arms around his neck, and he held her, this brave little girl who'd survived so much and still had the courage to hope for something better. I can do it, she said against his shoulder. I can do anything if it means I get to stay with you. Jack closed his eyes, holding her tight, and for the first time in 12 years he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, broken things could be put back together after all. The 90 days that followed were the hardest and best of Jack's life. He continued working at the hardware store, where Ray had quietly given him a raise and more hours. He attended therapy every Wednesday afternoon with Dr. Linda Morse, a patient woman who gently pushed him to talk about Caroline and Lily, about the guilt he carried, about the 12 years he'd spent running from his pain. You can't be a good parent to Emma if you're still carrying all this unprocessed grief, Dr. Morse said during one session. It'll leak out. It'll affect how you see her, how you respond to her needs. I'm terrified I'll fail her, Jack admitted, the way I failed my own family. You didn't fail your family, Jack. You weren't even there when the accident happened. But you are blaming yourself for something that was completely out of your control. I should have been there. Why? So you could die too? Would that have been better? The question hit him like a punch. He didn't have an answer. Surviving isn't a crime, Dr. Morse said gently, and choosing to live again, to love again, that's not betraying Caroline and Lily, that's honoring them. The family counseling sessions with Emma were different. They met every Saturday morning in a bright, cheerful office with toys and art supplies. The counselor, Marcus Reed, was a young guy with an easy smile who had a gift for making even difficult conversations feel safe. He asked Emma to draw pictures of her feelings, asked her to talk about the crash, about Linda and Mark, about her fears and hopes, asked Jack to share stories about his life, about the mountain, about what he imagined their future together might look like. Slowly, painfully, beautifully, they built something together. Not a replacement for what either of them had lost, but something new, something theirs. Emma started calling him Dad during their 4th session. She said it casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world, asking, "Dad, can we make pancakes when I come to the cabin?" Jack's throat had closed up. He'd managed to nod, managed to say yes, but he'd had to excuse himself to the bathroom afterward to pull himself together. Marcus had found him there, offered him a tissue, and said quietly, "That's a big step for her. How are you feeling about it?" "Terrified," Jack admitted, honored, completely overwhelmed. "That sounds about right for parenthood," Marcus said with a smile. The visits increased in length and frequency. Full days now, sometimes overnight weekend visits. Emma came to the cabin and helped Jack chop vegetables for dinner, learned to feed the chickens he'd started raising, sat by the fire while he read to her from books they'd checked out from the library. She still had nightmares sometimes, still woke up crying, calling for Linda and Mark. And Jack learned to sit with her through them, to hold her when she needed it, to give her space when she needed that instead. "I feel bad," Emma said one night after a particularly bad dream. "Is it okay that I miss them even though I'm happy with you?" "Of course it's okay," Jack said gently. "Love isn't a limited thing, kiddo. You can miss the people you lost and still make room for new people. That's not betraying anybody. That's just being human." Emma had nodded against his shoulder and fallen back asleep. The final hearing date arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April. Spring had come to the mountains, tentative and beautiful, melting the last of the winter snow. Jack wore the same thrift store suit, but this time Emma was with him, wearing a blue dress that Ruth had helped her pick out. They sat together in the courtroom, Emma's small hand gripping Jack's like a lifeline. Margaret sat on their other side, her usual stern expression softened just slightly. Judge Chen reviewed the reports from the therapy sessions, the counseling notes, the continued housing inspections, the school reports showing Emma's improved grades and behavior. Then she looked directly at Emma. "Miss Foster, I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay?" Emma nodded, sitting up straighter. "You've been spending time with Mr. Sullivan over the past few months. How has that been for you?" "Good," Emma said, her voice small but clear. "Really good. He teaches me stuff and he listens when I talk, and he doesn't get mad when I have bad dreams. He makes me feel safe." "And you want to live with him permanently?" "Yes, ma'am," Emma said. "He's my dad now. I mean, not like officially, but in my heart. He's my dad." Judge Chen's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. Then she turned to Jack. "Mr. Sullivan, are you prepared to take on the full responsibility of raising this child? Understanding that it means sacrificing your independence, your solitude, and quite possibly your sanity on a regular basis?" Despite the tension, Jack almost smiled. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm ready." The judge was quiet for a long moment, then she picked up her gavel. "I've seen a lot of cases come through this court, a lot of broken families, a lot of children in need, a lot of adults who say they want to help but aren't willing to do the work. Mr. Sullivan, you have done the work. You have transformed not just your living situation, but yourself. And Miss Foster, you have shown remarkable resilience and maturity throughout this process." She looked at both of them. "It is the judgment of this court that guardianship of Emma Rose Foster is hereby granted to Jack Sullivan, effective immediately. Congratulations, you're a father." The gavel came down, and Emma launched herself at Jack with a cry of joy that echoed through the courtroom. He caught her, holding her tight while she cried and laughed at the same time, and he felt something he hadn't felt in 12 years. He felt whole. The first night Emma came home to the cabin as Jack's daughter, not as a visitor, felt both monumental and ordinary at the same time. Jack carried her small suitcase inside, the one containing everything she owned in the world, which wasn't much. Some clothes, a stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 3, a few books, and the notebook where she'd been drawing pictures ever since that first day in the cabin months ago. Emma stood in the doorway, looking around like she was seeing it for the first time, even though she'd been there dozens of times during visits. But this was different. This time she wasn't leaving. "Your room's ready," Jack said, gesturing to the bedroom he'd built. I tried to make it nice. Ruth helped me pick out some stuff." Emma walked slowly to the doorway of her room and stopped. The walls were painted a soft lavender color. White curtains hung at the window. There was a bed with a handmade quilt, a small desk for homework, a bookshelf already filled with books from the library's donation sale, and on the wall above the bed, a framed picture that made Emma's breath catch. It was the drawing she'd made during those first days, the one showing the cabin, the wood stove, and the two stick figures, her and Jack. He'd kept it, framed it, hung it where she'd see it every morning when she woke up. "Do you like it?" Jack asked, suddenly nervous. "I can change things if you want. Paint it a different color or—" Emma turned and hugged him so tight he almost stumbled backward. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It's the most perfect room I've ever had." Jack held her, one hand gently resting on the back of her head, and felt his eyes burn. "Welcome home, kiddo." The first weeks were an adjustment for both of them. Jack had lived alone for so long he'd forgotten what it was like to share space with another person. Emma had been in the system long enough that she wasn't used to stability, to knowing she could count on someone being there tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. They developed routines. Jack woke Emma up at 6:30 every morning, made her breakfast while she got dressed for school. Oatmeal most days, sometimes eggs, occasionally pancakes when they had time. He drove her the 30 minutes down the mountain to Timber Ridge Elementary, then headed to work at the hardware store. After school, Emma went to an after-school program run by the church until Jack could pick her up at 5. Then home, homework at the kitchen table while Jack made dinner, bath time, story time, bed by 8:30. Simple, normal, healing. But it wasn't always easy. 2 weeks in, Emma had a meltdown over a math worksheet. She crumpled the paper, threw her pencil across the room, and started crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Jack knelt beside her chair, trying to remember what Dr. Morse and Marcus had taught him about handling big emotions. Hey, it's okay," he said gently. "It's just homework. We can figure it out together." "I'm stupid," Emma sobbed. "I'm never going to get it, and everyone else in my class already knows how, and I'm the dumbest one there." "You're not stupid," Jack said firmly. "You're 7 years old and you're learning. That's what 7-year-olds do. They learn, they make mistakes, they try again." "But what if I can't do it? What if I mess up so bad that you don't want me anymore?" And there it was. The real fear underneath the math frustration. The fear that had lived in Emma since she was 4 years old and her mother went to jail and her father disappeared. The fear that love was conditional, that one wrong move would make her unwanted again. Jack pulled her into his lap, letting her cry against his shoulder. "Emma, listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. You could fail every math test from now until high school, and I would still be right here. You could throw 100 pencils, crumple 1,000 papers, and I would still love you. That's what family means. It means I'm here no matter what." Emma cried harder, but different now. Not from frustration, but from relief. From finally believing, maybe for the first time in her life, that someone meant it when they said forever. After she calmed down, they worked through the math together. It took an hour, and she still didn't fully understand fractions, but she finished the worksheet. And more importantly, she went to bed that night knowing she was safe. School became another adjustment. Emma had been enrolled in Timber Ridge Elementary during her time with the Hendersons, but now she was the girl living on the mountain with the hermit. Some kids were curious, some were mean, and Emma came home more than once with stories about classmates saying her dad was weird or creepy or crazy. "What do you tell them?" Jack asked one afternoon after a particularly bad day. Emma shrugged, picking at her sandwich. "I tell them they don't know you, that you're not weird, you're just quiet, and that you're the best dad anybody could have, even if you don't talk to a lot of people." Jack's throat tightened. "You don't have to defend me, kiddo." "I want to," Emma said simply. "Because it's true." But defending Jack got harder when Emma invited a classmate over for a playdate and the girl's mother said no. Not with an excuse, just a flat no, followed by a comment about not being comfortable with Emma's situation. Emma cried that night, and Jack held her, rage burning in his chest at a world that could be so cruel to a child. But he swallowed the anger and just let her feel what she needed to feel. "Some people are scared of what they don't understand," he said quietly. "And your life, our life, it's different from what most folks are used to. But different doesn't mean wrong. It just means different." "I wish I was normal," Emma whispered. "Normal's overrated," Jack said. "You're you, and that's better than normal any day." But the isolation bothered him. Emma needed friends, needed connections beyond just him. So he started saying yes to things he'd spent 12 years avoiding. School events, parent-teacher conferences, the church's Sunday potlucks that Ruth kept inviting them to. The first potluck was torture. Jack stood in the corner of the fellowship hall with a plate of Ruth's casserole, watching Emma play with other kids, hyper-aware of the whispers, the sideways glances. But then Ray from the hardware store appeared beside him. "Looks like you survived," Ray said, nodding toward Emma, who was laughing at something another girl had said. "Barely," Jack muttered. "Gets easier," Ray said. "People get used to you, and the ones who don't, well, they're not worth your time anyway." Slowly, painfully, it did get easier. Jack started recognizing faces at school pickup, started having brief conversations with other parents, started feeling less like an outsider and more like just another tired dad trying his best. And Emma bloomed. Her teacher, Mrs. Carson, pulled Jack aside one day and told him Emma's grades had improved dramatically, that she was participating more in class, making friends, even joined the art club. "Whatever you're doing," Mrs. Carson said, "keep doing it. She's a different child than she was 3 months ago." But the real breakthrough came on a Saturday afternoon in late June, nearly 3 months after the guardianship was finalized. Jack and Emma were working in the garden he'd started, planting tomatoes and beans, when Emma stopped mid-dig and looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Always," Jack said. "Do you ever think about your daughter, your real daughter?" Jack's hand stilled on the shovel. He'd known this question would come eventually, but it still hit him hard. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think about her every day." "Does it make you sad that I'm not her?" Jack set down the shovel and turned to Emma, making sure she could see his face. "You want the truth?" Emma nodded. "At first it did make me sad, not because you're not her, but because being with you reminded me of everything I lost. Every time you smiled or laughed or did something that reminded me of Lily, it hurt. But you know what else it did?" "What?" "It reminded me that I could still love someone, that my heart wasn't completely broken, that maybe I deserved a second chance to be a father." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Emma's ear. "You're not Lily, and I would never want you to be. You're Emma, and that's exactly who you're supposed to be. And I love you for who you are, not as a replacement for someone I lost, but as my daughter. Does that make sense?" Emma thought about it, her small face serious. Then she nodded. "I think so. It's like how I can miss Linda and Mark but still be happy with you." "Exactly like that." Emma went back to digging, then said casually, "I'm glad you got a second chance. And I'm glad I got one too." Jack had to turn away to wipe his eyes. The summer passed in a blur of simple pleasures. Fishing in the creek behind the cabin, teaching Emma to identify edible plants, long hikes through the mountains where Jack shared everything he'd learned about survival, and Emma chatted constantly about everything from dinosaurs to her favorite TV shows. They started a tradition of Friday movie nights, where they'd make popcorn on the stove and watch whatever Emma picked from the library's DVD collection. Jack sat through more animated princess movies than he ever thought possible, and found himself actually enjoying them because of the way Emma's face lit up. He taught her to play cards, and she taught him about TikTok dances she'd learned at school. He showed her how to chop wood safely, and she showed him how to braid hair using YouTube tutorials. They were teaching each other how to be a family. But Jack knew the real test would come when school started again in the fall. Emma would be entering 3rd grade, and the newness of their situation would have worn off. People would have opinions, questions, judgments. He underestimated how much Emma had changed. On the first day of 3rd grade, Jack walked Emma to her classroom, prepared for anxiety or fear. Instead, when another kid asked loudly, "Why does your dad dress like a lumberjack?" Emma just shrugged and said, "Because he is one. He's also a hardware store manager and the best cook, and he can build anything out of wood. What does your dad do?" The kid stammered something about an accountant, and Emma smiled sweetly and walked into the classroom like she owned the place. Jack stood in the hallway, stunned and incredibly proud. That fall, something else started happening. Other parents began approaching Jack, not with suspicion or judgment, but with questions. A single father struggling with his daughter after a divorce asked how Jack handled bedtime routines. A mother whose son had severe anxiety asked what Jack did when Emma had nightmares. A foster family considering adoption asked if he'd be willing to talk to them about his experience. At first, Jack tried to deflect. He wasn't an expert. He was just a guy figuring it out as he went. But Ruth pulled him aside after church one Sunday. "You don't see it, do you?" she said. "See what?" "What your story means to people. You're a single father who adopted a traumatized child out of the foster system. You completely changed your life to give her a home. People look at you and see hope. They see proof that it's possible." "I'm not some inspiration," Jack protested. "I'm just doing what anybody would do." Ruth shook her head. "That's where you're wrong. Most people wouldn't. Most people would have left her in that storm, or brought her to town and walked away, or given up when the process got hard, but you didn't, and that matters." The conversation stuck with Jack. He started saying yes when people asked to talk. Started sharing honestly about the hard parts, the mistakes he'd made, the nights he'd cried in the shower because he was terrified he was screwing everything up. And somehow that honesty helped people more than any polished success story could have. By Emma's 8th birthday in November, Jack's life had become something he never could have imagined 2 years earlier. He woke up to a child singing off-key in the shower. He packed school lunches with notes tucked inside. He attended parent-teacher conferences and volunteered for the school bake sale and knew the names of Emma's friends and their parents. He wasn't the hermit on the mountain anymore. He was Jack Sullivan, Emma's dad, and that identity fit better than any he'd worn before. For Emma's birthday, Jack threw her first real party. He was terrified, had never thrown a kid's party in his life, but with Ruth's help and Ray's donation of supplies from the hardware store, they transformed the cabin into something magical. Streamers hung from the ceiling. A homemade cake sat on the table, slightly lopsided but covered in purple frosting per Emma's request. 8 kids from her class showed up, their parents dropping them off without hesitation, and spent the afternoon playing games, eating pizza, and running wild around the property. Jack watched from the porch as Emma laughed with her friends, her face flushed with joy, and felt something settle in his chest. This was what healing looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of joy despite it. When the last kid left and Emma collapsed on the couch, exhausted and happy, she looked at Jack with shining eyes. "Best birthday ever," she declared. "Yeah?" Jack asked, sitting beside her. "Yeah, because all my favorite people were here, and I got to share my home with them, and nobody looked at us like we were weird. They just looked at us like we were normal." "We are normal," Jack said. "Just our own kind of normal." Emma nodded, already half asleep. "I like our kind of normal." As fall turned to winter, Jack started thinking about the future in a way he hadn't in years. Not just surviving day to day, but actually planning. He'd been talking with Ray about eventually taking over management of the hardware store when Ray retired. He'd been looking into online classes to finish the college degree he'd abandoned decades ago. He'd even been considering selling some of the land around the cabin to create a college fund for Emma. But the biggest change came in January, almost exactly 2 years after he'd found Emma in that storm. Margaret Hayes called and asked if Jack would be willing to speak at a conference for prospective foster and adoptive parents. The state was trying to recruit more single parents and non-traditional families to consider fostering, and they wanted real stories from people who'd successfully navigated the system. Jack's first instinct was to say no. Public speaking terrified him. But then he thought about all the kids out there like Emma, waiting for someone to take a chance on them. And he thought about all the people out there like him, capable of loving a child, but convinced they weren't good enough. "I'll do it," he told Margaret. The conference was held in Denver in a hotel ballroom with at least 200 people in attendance. Jack stood backstage in the same thrift store suit, palms sweating, wondering what the hell he'd been thinking. Emma was with him. She'd insisted on coming, had even prepared a little speech of her own about what it was like being adopted. "You got this, Dad," she said, squeezing his hand. "Just tell them the truth. That's all they need to hear." When Jack walked onto that stage, the lights were blinding. But then he found Emma in the front row, giving him a thumbs up, and something in him steadied. He told them everything. About living alone on a mountain for 12 years. About finding a dying child in a snowstorm. About the terror of deciding to fight for her. About the 8 weeks of transforming his entire life. About the mistakes he'd made, and the moments he'd failed, and the nights he'd wanted to give up. And then he told them about the joy. About Emma's first day in her room. About her laughter filling a cabin that had been silent for so long. About becoming a father again, and discovering that grief and love could coexist, that honoring the past didn't mean refusing the future. "I'm not special," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm just a guy who said yes when every logical part of my brain was screaming no. And that yes changed everything. Not just for Emma, but for me. She didn't just get a home, I got my life back." When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then people rose to their feet, applauding, some wiping tears from their eyes. Emma ran onto the stage and hugged him, and Jack held her, while 200 strangers witnessed what a second chance looked like. After the conference, things began to shift in ways Jack hadn't anticipated. The local news picked up the story. Then a regional paper. Then a national adoption advocacy organization reached out, asking if they could feature Jack and Emma's story in their campaign. Jack wanted to say no to all of it. This was their private life, their personal journey. But Emma surprised him. "Maybe we should say yes," she said one night over dinner. "Because what if our story helps other kids find families? What if there's another kid out there like me and another dad like you, and they just need to know it's possible?" She was 8 years old and wiser than he'd ever been, so they said yes. They did interviews, always together, always honest about the hard parts. Jack talked about his grief, his isolation, his fear. Emma talked about the crash, about being in foster care, about learning to trust again. And the responses started coming in. Letters from single parents who'd been inspired to foster. Emails from people who'd lost families and thought they'd never love again. Messages from kids in the system who said seeing Emma's story gave them hope. One letter in particular hit Jack hard. It was from a man in Montana who'd lost his son 5 years earlier and had been living alone ever since. He'd seen Jack's interview and decided to look into fostering. 6 months later, he sent a photo of himself with 2 brothers he'd just adopted, ages 6 and 9. "You showed me it was possible," the letter said. "Thank you for having the courage to try." Jack pinned that letter to the wall in his workshop next to Emma's drawing and looked at it whenever he needed a reminder of why any of this mattered. 2 years became 3, then 4. Emma grew taller, lost teeth, learned to ride a bike, joined the soccer team, discovered a love for painting, got her first best friend, had her first fight with that best friend, and made up the next day. All the normal, beautiful, messy parts of childhood that Jack had thought he'd never get to witness again. And Jack grew too. He became president of the PTA, much to his own disbelief. He started a mentorship program connecting single fathers in the county. He finished his degree online in social work. He even started dating, briefly, though nothing serious. Emma was his priority, and any woman who wanted to be in his life had to understand that. On the 5th anniversary of finding Emma in that storm, Jack drove them back to the spot where it had happened. The fallen tree was still there, weathered and moss-covered now. Emma stood beside it, no longer a terrified 7-year-old, but a confident 12-year-old with paint-stained hands and her father's quiet strength. "Do you remember it?" Jack asked. "Not really," Emma admitted. "Sometimes I have dreams about being cold and scared, but I don't know if those are real memories or just my brain filling in gaps." "Do you wish you remembered more?" Emma thought about it. "No. I think maybe my brain protected me by letting me forget the worst parts. And anyway, what matters isn't how I got here. It's that I'm here now." She pulled something from her pocket, a small painted rock with the words, "Home is not a place, it's a person," written in careful letters. "Mrs. Carson had us make these in art class," Emma explained. "She said we should give them to the person who makes us feel most at home." She handed it to Jack. "So this is for you." Jack took the rock, his vision blurring. "Emma, I know," she said simply. "You don't have to say it, I know." But Jack said it anyway. "I love you, kiddo. More than I thought it was possible to love anything again." "I love you too, Dad." They stood there together in the clearing where their story began, father and daughter, two broken pieces that had somehow made each other whole. The present day found Jack at 58 years old, though he looked better than he had at 53. The lines around his eyes were from smiling now instead of grief. His hands were still calloused, but from building soccer goal nets and school project volcanoes instead of just surviving. Emma was applying to colleges, her bedroom walls covered with acceptance letters. She'd grown into a remarkable young woman, an artist, an advocate, someone who wanted to study social work and help kids like she'd been. "I want to make sure other kids get the chance I got," she told Jack. "I want to find the ones everybody else gives up on and prove that they're worth fighting for." Jack helped her fill out financial aid forms at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd struggled through math homework and shared countless dinners and built a life together one conversation at a time. "You know I'm going to miss you like crazy when you leave, right?" Jack said. Emma smiled. "I'm going to miss you too, but I'm only going to be 2 hours away. I'll come home every weekend if you want." "Every weekend might be excessive," Jack said, even though part of him wanted to say yes. "But once a month sounds good." "Deal." As they worked through the forms, Jack thought about the 5-year-old question he'd been asked by Judge Chen. "Are you prepared to sacrifice your independence, your solitude, and quite possibly your sanity?" He'd said yes without fully understanding what it meant. Now he knew. It meant sleepless nights with sick kids and nerve-wracking driving lessons and awkward conversations about puberty and boys and all the terrifying, wonderful parts of watching someone grow up. It meant his house was never quiet anymore, never just his. It meant compromise and negotiation and learning that being a parent meant sometimes being wrong and having to apologize. It meant his heart lived outside his body now, walking around in the world where he couldn't always protect it, and he wouldn't trade a single second of it. Later that week, Jack was asked to speak at another event, this time a fundraiser for the county foster system. Standing in front of another crowd, looking out at faces hungry for hope, he told a story he'd told dozens of times before, but still felt new every time. 5 years ago, I found a little girl dying in a snowstorm, he began. Everyone told me to leave her there to save myself. Said I wasn't equipped, wasn't qualified, wasn't the right person. And they were right about a lot of that. I wasn't equipped. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was willing to learn. And sometimes that's enough. He paused, finding Emma in the crowd, now 17 and sitting beside Ruth and Ray and Sheriff Davis and all the people who'd helped them build this life. Emma didn't just get a home when I said yes to fighting for her. I got my life back. I got purpose again. I got to learn that the heart is more resilient than we think, that love isn't a finite resource, that choosing to show up even when you're terrified is the bravest thing any of us can do. He looked directly at the prospective foster parents in the audience. There's a kid out there waiting for you. Maybe they're in a snowstorm. Maybe they're in a group home. Maybe they're in a situation you can't even imagine. And they don't need you to be perfect. They just need you to be willing, to show up, to try, to believe they're worth the effort, even when the world says they're not." His voice cracked slightly. "That little girl saved my life as much as I saved hers. And if you're sitting here wondering if you can do this, if you're capable, if you're enough, let me tell you something. You probably are. You just have to be brave enough to find out." The applause was thunderous, but Jack barely heard it. He was watching Emma, tears streaming down her face, mouthing the words, "Thank you." That night, back at the cabin, Jack and Emma sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The same mountains where Jack had spent 12 years hiding from the world. The same mountains that had brought Emma to him in a storm that should have killed her. "Dad?" Emma said quietly. "Yes, sweetheart? Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day? Or if you had found me but decided I was too much trouble?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. And it terrifies me. Because I think about who I'd still be, alone on this mountain, slowly disappearing. And I think about who you'd be, if you'd even survived. And then I stop thinking about it because it hurts too much." "Me too," Emma admitted. "Sometimes I have nightmares that I wake up and this was all a dream, that I'm still in the group home or still lost in the snow or still just waiting for someone to want me." Jack pulled her closer. "This is real. You're real. We're real. And you never have to wait to be wanted again because you're already home." Emma leaned her head on his shoulder. "I know, but sometimes I still can't believe how lucky I got." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Jack said. "You survived because you're strong. You thrived because you chose to trust again, even after everything you'd been through. That's not luck, kiddo. That's courage." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The wind whispered through the pines. The world turned, indifferent and beautiful, and in that moment, Jack understood something he'd spent years learning. That healing isn't about forgetting the past or moving on from grief. It's about making room for new joy alongside old pain. It's about honoring what was lost while embracing what's been found. He'd lost Caroline and Lily, and that would always hurt. There would always be a space in his heart where they lived, where their memory remained sacred and untouched. But there was also room for Emma now. Room for this fierce, funny, brave girl who'd stumbled into his life and refused to let him stay broken. Room for a second chance he never thought he deserved, but grabbed onto anyway with both hands. "I'm glad you didn't leave me in the snow," Emma said softly. Jack kissed the top of her head. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is reach out when everything in you says run. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who admit they're terrified but keep going anyway. Sometimes the best families are the ones built from broken pieces, glued together with courage and hope and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other." Jack Sullivan had spent 12 years running from love because he was afraid of losing it again. Emma Foster had spent 7 years wondering if anyone would ever choose her. And then a snowstorm brought them together, and they chose each other. Not because it was easy, not because it made sense, not because anyone told them it would work, but because when you find someone worth fighting for, you fight, even when you're scared, even when the odds are impossible, even when every logical voice says it's too hard, too risky, too much. You fight anyway. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you win. Anyone can change a life if they're willing to say yes when the world expects them to walk away. Anyone can become someone's hero if they show up when it matters most. Anyone can build a family if they understand that love isn't about biology or perfection. It's about choice, commitment, and the courage to keep trying even when everything feels impossible. As the night settled over the mountain, Jack and Emma went inside their home, the one they'd built together from determination and hope. Behind them, the door closed on a chapter that had started with a dying child in a storm and ended with a thriving young woman ready to change the world. And ahead of them, stretched infinite tomorrows, each one a gift they'd almost missed, each one proof that second chances are real if you're brave enough to reach for them. Because Jack Sullivan didn't just save Emma's life that day in the snow. Emma saved his right back. And together they proved that sometimes the most broken people make the best healers, the most lost souls make the best guides, and the most unlikely families make the strongest homes. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep the journey going. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that courage changes everything and that one choice can transform 2 lives forever.